Hi, I'm Ethan Wong, and today I'm here speaking with Dr. Keita. We'll just get straight into the questions. I think the question I ask universally to everyone, and I start off every interview with this, is what is special about poetry? Why poetry specifically over any other medium? And as I guess a part B to that question, what kind of shifted you over from a reader of poetry into also a writer of poetry?
What shifted me from a reader to a writer, or rather what invited the writing to
Yeah.
join the reading? Because I hate to start out with a lecture point, but just for a varied audience, it's important to realize that you never stop reading poetry. It's there's no either or. You're involved in a tradition and in a culture, a multi-layered culture. So you learn a lot by reading other poets. That's just part of understanding what you're trying to do too. But what shifted me? I was about 13, and when you're 13 years old and you live in the city of Philadelphia, where I did, in a neighborhood where at a point in time where kids used to run the street, play double dutch, we were out in the street all day. But when you're 13 and you're a girl, sometimes you don't want to do that anymore. But you're not old enough to work or get a summer job, which was something I wanted to do. So I was sort of in the house, trying to avoid my mother, who would give me more domestic chores if she found me. And I found a television show on public television, and it was a whole array of Black poets. And that was an unusual show at that time. And I didn't have anything else to do. And they all had these resplendent afros, and they were dressed really distinctively. And I sat down to watch it. And what those poets were saying resonated with things I had thought, things I had felt, things I had seen in the neighborhood, at church, in my family, on the bus. And I realized at that moment, in the course of watching that program, it was a program out of New York City. And I realized that poetry was something that was accessible to me, and that it might be a way to say some of the things that rolled around in my head all the time that I really didn't have anybody else to talk to about or share with. And I was already kind of definitely an introvert, a bookish girl. So the idea of sitting around writing things in a journal was fine with me. I wasn't, longing to sort of be doing something radically different. So, and I didn't, and I was sort of at loose ends, as I said. So, I got really fascinated with each successive poet, I sort of got more and more a sense of liberation to be able to try writing in this way. And they also were writing in very colloquial language, and they weren't writing in some lofty, archaic, remote kind of fashion, but they were writing the way people around me spoke. Although there was inventiveness to the way they were working the language. So those two things were also really interesting to me. Like, there was a way to take the language I heard all the time and sort of shape it in some way that felt real to me. So that's what kicked off the whole project that's still going.
Yeah, and there's a lot there that I resonate with in terms of having poetry be a way to express the thoughts that are just kind of in your head all the time. And it feels like a way to collect them and define them even for yourself, because otherwise they're just there and you can't even make them out. And I kind of want to move on a little quickly. Sorry, I was going to say real quick, but then for some reason that changed a little quickly to my head. Anyways, to talking about kind of your recent projects in Brief Evidence of Heaven, poems from the life of Anna Murray Douglas, kind of what parts of the writing process that you had to do for that were unique to this project, and what kind of parts were universal? Just kind of give us an insight on, I guess, your writing process in general.
Okay, so I don't know how much the audience might know, but Anna Murray Douglas was Frederick Douglass's first wife. And I got intrigued by her when I learned about her and learned that she was his wife for a long time, for 44 years. I'd never heard of her, and I wondered why. And I found out that I became more intrigued when I found out that she was illiterate and remained illiterate more or less her whole life. And so so trying to figure out how to write about her, I had to learn something about her. So some of the things I did, and I'll just sort of bullet point some things. Of course, I started with many of the books that Frederick Douglass wrote. And the project sort of leaped forward when I discovered that he wrote almost nothing. He mentioned his wife almost not at all. Or at least I'll say his first wife. He married again late after she died, and he talked about that wife much more. But so what did I do? I started to read anything I could find about Frederick Douglass and try to understand his life and where she fit into it. I traveled. I actually traveled to places where they lived together on the East Coast and in New York State, and look and sort of walked the streets and walked the Baltimore Harbor and took lots of notes. I traveled to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where they lived early on, and to Rochester, New York, where they ran an underground railroad station. So, and then I read about other people who were in their part of their community. I looked at maps. I looked up sort of 19th century maps. I read about the laws, the enslavement laws of the 19th century. Photographs, I was always looking for 19th century photographs. I looked at websites that showed how women dressed in the 19th century, especially women who were poor like she was early on. So I even had a website bookmarked about what kind of flowers grew in New York, in upper New York State, when I was working on a poem about her while she in her house in Rochester, and I wanted to talk about her garden. So I did a lot of crazy research, and I spent a lot of time on the Smithsonian website, which has a whole section devoted to Frederick Douglass. So
Yeah.
that's a summary. There's other stuff.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of leads me into my next question, which is, given that there are so many unique processes for something when you're writing about, especially history, like material history, in terms of you can go to those places, you can experience those things, and you can research those kinds of things. What do you find tends to be different or special, or I guess really valuable about writing about history as opposed to writing, I guess, less about history? Because I think it's very hard to say you ever write without or not about history at all. But kind of, what do you think is the value in focusing on it?
Well, you know, there's a quote I was trying to keep handy, and it looks like I've lost track of it. No, here it is. There's a poet named Gerald Stern who I snagged this quote from him one time where he said, "No matter how you hide it, you can't help writing about your place and time." So your place and time is historical, even at this moment, right? So there, part of the question goes toward how do we think about history? I sense that in your question, you're really talking about a more far-reaching history, but we're in history right now. We're in history all the time. And I don't even have to say anything about the last 2 years, right?
Yeah.
We have made collective contemporary history with our daily lives in the last 2 years. So, but in terms of other reasons to do it, is that it brings your life and your point of view and all of the energy that's behind what you're creating. It puts it into perspective. It gives perspective on what are you doing here right now? How did you end up being in the space where we're talking to each other? How did I end up being here? So poetry is, I'm sorry, history is bound to speak to you. History is not something like remote, like the planet Neptune. It defines how we're living our lives now.
Yeah.
So I think that you can't help but grow by learning it. What we learn in school that's called history is just a very constructed version, a very carefully constructed version that leaves out all sorts of things, all sorts of issues, and all sorts of people. And I happen to descend from people who have systematically been left out of history. So of course, I'm learning and more about both how I've learned to see the world, but also how the world sees me, and just learning, getting more perspective on why I see things the way I do. So there's tons of things more I could say, but those are some key points to your question.
Yeah, I think it's so important because just seeing yourself represented in history is just a weirdly empowering thing, just to know. It's like something really small, but even when I would just hear about like Chinese workers or Chinese people in America in history, it would make me feel like I was kind of represented, like, yeah, I have a place here, or I have a place in history when they include parts about the Chinese Empire in the curriculum. And I think just understanding that there are a lot of parts that are still left out and we need to actually like figure out to include them. I think it's a really important lesson to figure out, just because, and sorry, I feel like I'm rambling, but
no,
I think
fine.
that connects to why it's important to write poetry about history, because poetry itself is also lends itself towards giving people power, giving people those kinds of emotional moments. And I think giving history to them through poetry, giving history to people is a really good way to use poetry.
Yeah, I agree, because the thing is, the way the history is traditionally written, even when it's less traditional, like I'm thinking about a book that I read during lockdown that was more expansive than your sort of more traditional textbook type of history, but it tends to be written. There's a thing about the voice, right? So, your typical historical book is going to be written in third person. It's going to be looking outward and sort of looking, in an effort to be objective, if that's really possible. It's looking outward at people and talking about people in the third person, and they did this and he did that, excuse me, and focused on what appeared to be facts. But the truth is sometimes operating in between the facts, and that's where poetry can have its way a bit more. Poetry can wiggle in between the facts and raise questions about what's missing. And poetry can also, going back to the idea of the voice, poetry, like with Brief Evidence, I'm talking about historical situations and perspectives, but I'm using a first person voice. I invented this voice for Anna Mary Douglas and sort of brought a sense of the personal world and the personal stake of the speaker into this historical space. So that becomes that makes a different effect for the reader, I think, than when everything is supposed to be sort of remote and impersonal and strictly factual. Because facts affect our lives, you know. So that's a difference.
Definitely. And I also wanted to ask, because I think you've talked about it before, but kind of the relationship between imagery and poetry. And the first question I'd ask is, what do you even, and I guess this is a bit of a weird question, but what do you even consider imagery to be in the context of a poem?
That's kind of a hard question, but I took a shot. So I see imagery. Imagery is a number of things. It's a spectrum of light, it's textures, the texture of surfaces, it's momentary snatches of life, it's nouns and verbs, it's adjectives and adverbs, it's prepositions, it's manifestations of all those things, physical manifestations. It's also a manifestation of emotional and psychological states. So all of that is sort of, that's the way I think about imagery. I'm very much driven by, I'm a very visual person. I'm the person somehow, well, it doesn't happen so much now that people use GPS, but I've often been the person people will stop and ask for directions. I don't know what it is. I don't know if there's something hovering over my head or what, but people used to always ask me for directions. And I give them directions in a way that reflects that fact that I'm visual. I'm not going to say 3 miles. I'm going to say go till you see the 7-Eleven on the corner. So because I take in the world very strongly in a visual way, imagery is like inseparable from basically that's what I'm doing with poems, is trying to use words to make pictures in a simplistic kind of way. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah, I totally understand that, because I think for me, at least, a lot of the times my poems start with an image in my head, and the entire length of the poem is kind of just an extensive effort to, as best I can, put that image into words.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what it feels like a lot of the time.
And because as I say to my students a lot, if there's the line that, the standard rule, show don't tell. But you'd be surprised at, like, it seems like something you get tired of hearing, but it really has meaning. When people aren't used to writing in a way that is driven by images, they'll say things, they'll put things in the poem, and in workshop, then I have to sometimes be the one to say, so what does that look like? What democracy? Why do you have democracy, the word democracy, in the poem? What does it look like? Can you show me what democracy looks like? And then they get that look like, oh, duh, and we have to talk about, like, what exactly are you trying to show us right now? And make it something that we can imagine, that we can see, that, use some, I'm also just dogged on nouns and verbs, use some nouns and verbs that create something visual. So yeah, so it's really important to me. It's really and as you say, like you're trying to describe, but I'm also tend to be using imagery to say something more about whatever the subject matter is.
Yeah.
But people can sort of grasp once they have something visual in mind, then all of the sort of allusions and connotations that come off of that come along, the other kinds of meaning come into it as well.
Yeah, because I found that as I read more and more poetry, the line between where we formally define like imagery in like very strict like English class terms, it doesn't really seem to fit with the way it's used in poetry. It doesn't seem to really align with the way I feel like poems can have imagery that's not even just strictly that kind of visual, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so I also wanted to ask, kind of, I guess you've kind of implicitly answered, but can poetry really exist without like traditional imagery, or what would it have to do then?
Yeah, now that was pretty brain teasy question. And I'm not typically the one to sort of extrapolate about poetry in the abstract, but I will say that, well, for me, no. That's an easy one. But can poetry exist without imagery? I was thinking a lot about that. And I mean, there I'll put it this way. There certainly are poems that advance other sensory features more than the visual. So I'm thinking about there's a poem, I was trying to find it, but I'm at home, and the book that the anthology I was looking for, I realized it's at work. But there was a poem in it, I don't remember who it was by, but it was called Funk, Florida. Funk, Florida. And it was a wordplay poem. So the poem was playing, the poet was playing with alliteration and rhythm. And so there were these sonic patterns that were driving the poem. It wasn't trying to sort of create any kind of single picture, but it was using the language in a pattern, so that you could almost hear like a kunga drum or something when you spoke the poem. So that was a way in which, I won't say that existed outside of imagery, but imagery wasn't the dominant feature. It wasn't what the poet was primarily going for. The poet was going more for sound pattern and sort of a play of rhythm in your ear. But even with that, right? Even with that collection of words that the poet chose is ultimately going to bring you some pictures as well. Right. So it's I mean, I'm not one for, there are all kinds of poets. I'm not one for the abstract and the cerebral without something something that is like sort of dripping with life going on as well. But I'm sure that there are people, and of course there's sort of abstract poetry and concrete poetry, and poetry that's made up of sort of sounds rather than words. So there's ways to get there. They're just not routes that I take. So
Yeah, no, I definitely couldn't see myself being a poet without imagery. I think it's just too important to kind of how I write it and how I even think of it. So one last question before we get into a reading of a poem. Kind of, and I'm going to use my own experience to kind of relate this, but I'm kind of in a place right now where, at least creatively, I feel sort of in a rut, because I feel almost as if I'm writing, sometimes I write these things, but I'm also trying to get away from kind of this past version of myself as a writer, where I want to kind of become something new. I think I've become almost stale in the way that I write, but it's almost like now I'm hopping from place to place trying to find my style or my voice, whatever that means.
Mhm.
And so what kind of advice do you have for someone in my position?
Um, okay, well, I'm going to give you, I was just doing this with one of my classes last week. And they're seniors, but some things just don't get old with me. One thing is to just be open to, this sounds kind of abstract, even though I was just talking against abstraction. But sort of, I think sometimes people get locked into what they're allowed to write about. So that might be working sort of in the background.
Mm.
And you have to let go of that. Another thing is to see possibilities in any number of places. You can, I was telling I'm teaching a persona poetry class right now, and I was telling them early on, you all have to refine your eavesdropping. Take the headphones out of your ears when you're standing in line to get in the cafeteria, and just listen to what people are saying. Ride the bus, be in the supermarket, be nosy, catch snatches of conversation from people that are passing you by. But the thing I was going to say that I sort of jumped ahead of, that I was telling my seniors, was this is my tried and true. You can open a book of poetry, you can open a book of short stories. If you could open a novel that has chapter titles, or but my favorite to do it with is a poetry anthology, and just read the titles. Read the titles. There's bound to be a title that pinches you, if not more than one, and make a list of those. Pull those out. You could do this forever, right? Just pull out titles, chapter titles, poem titles, even song titles, short story titles that like set something off for you, and then go to your notebook and write about like what's going on when you read that word or phrase or sentence, and see or just sort of let you just purely free write and let the title carry you off in whatever direction that it carries you. So and what do you have then? Maybe 2 or 3 pages of what my students sometimes call word vomit. But what you also have is the raw material for something.
Yeah.
So of course, I mean, I work according to process. So 3 pages of gobbledygook is like fun to me. Like, I'm not expecting to sit down and write a poem because I read a title that I thought was exciting. But it gets me thinking, and I put my thinking on paper, and then I go through it sort of like people pick trash or whatever, and I shake out what I'm interested in there, and then I start over with those bits, and sort of see what forms up out of all the excess. You're not going to use all of that stuff, but you pull some out, and take it in its own direction, and lather, rinse, repeat.
I think a
So
lot of
that's something I would suggest, that never fails.
Mhm.
Never.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just kind of, there's a lot of patience that I need to have in these processes, within these processes specifically. And I need
Yes.
to learn that more, because I think I'm also a very impatient person when it comes to my writing. I think that might be a big part of it.
No, if I may just say, Ethan, that's a hard one. Okay. You may be wrestling with yourself on that question for years. I still catch myself. Like, I have something on my clipboard on my desk right now. And when I have to leave to go wash dishes or go do something else, I try to put a little note at the bottom so that I know what I was thinking about, what I want to do next. And I had to put a little note at the bottom of this draft and say, you're doing it. You're trying to push it. you want an outcome too quickly, so stop forcing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you want to see it come to fruition a little faster sometimes than the poem is ready to do.
Yeah.
So I feel you. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and if you're ready, you could get into reading a poem.
Okay, sure. I am sorry. I probably should have had it pulled out because I had two different piles. I'm going to read this poem because we've been talking a bit more about brief evidence of heaven. I have a new manuscript that's still evolving, that's going to come out next year. But this poem has a sad story. It was supposed to be in Brief Evidence of Heaven. It's part of the collection, but there was a clerical error and it got left out of the book. So but it was fully intended to be in there. So I'm going to give it its shot at getting some attention. And so just to set the scene a little bit, again, all the poems are persona poems. Most of them are in the voice of Anna Mary Douglas, as I imagined her. And as I said, she was illiterate, but she was married to one of the most literate and probably the most widely known Black man of the 19th century. So she found herself often in the company of lots of other people who could read and write and were highly informed and were anti-slavery advocates. So that's what I was thinking about when I wrote this poem. It's called Tea at the Antislavery Society. Lips alone make so much to study. Let your eyes take in some quiet. Wait until a shoulder turns. Look again. Those lips steal the story from twig to branch to ash. Add the eyes, the hands, the shoulders, and you've got a book. The cover, the marks, and all the pages. Every sound my heart holds back to sit and handle in the dark starts with lips, sour fruit that I've seen shrivel and come back to life. Cleaver, torch, broken shell of an egg, fish scale, soup spoon. The longer you look, the more comes true.
Thank you for that. That was amazing.
You're welcome.
And thank you for being here today.
You're very welcome.